Chapter 9, Masses and Mountaintops. I want to start off with just kind of get a glimpse of what society in the United States is like back then, around the 1920s or so. Seth, what's it like? Huh? Now I have to cut the AC so I can hear you. Yell. What's it like? What do you notice? Yeah, it's a little bit. Well, I guess we could say is it different as Pluto? What do you think? What's it like? What's it like there? What does this describe about the United States? What do you pick up on the most? Very racist. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. Pretty racist. Pretty brutally racist, I would say. Perhaps not the same as now. Hopefully, we don't see the same kind of things going on, but we get some really incredible descriptions of things that many of us never learned about in school, such as what were called the riots, but were actually a form of clearing out Black neighborhoods. It happened in many different places in the United States during this time. And the book we're concentrating in this time during the 1920s. So during about 100 years ago, which is sometimes seen as a great time in the United States, the roaring 20s and all that stuff, right before the Great Depression. For African Americans, how do you think it was? Are things getting better? This is 60 years after the Civil War. Slavery's ended. Liam?
There are laws now.
There are laws now. Yeah. Things are actually, in some ways, you could say, getting worse, right? This is the era of what they call Jim Crow. So you had this era after the Civil War where you could say that certain advances were made, not as much as people wanted, but it seemed like things were improving in certain ways in terms of political representation, the right to vote, freedom from enslavement. But in the 1920s, a lot of these laws come in that are limiting again. And so in some ways, it's usually important, I think, because I think a lot of times in school, we tend to think that things are just getting better and better and better for people who are non-majority people in the United States. But in this case, it's one of those things that things are actually getting worse than they were in years prior. And you can see this kind of legislation developing in all of these states. And we've talked about how this is also a time when there is the eugenics movement is gathering force. There's the forced sterilization of people going on. There's the anti-immigration acts which are passed, which are trying to limit the immigration of others. So certain things are changing. Of course, we have the right of women to vote, but certain things are changing in other directions at once. And so we especially see this perhaps in that wonderful state of Florida. I always wondered about this place called Florida, and now I learned a lot about it. Anybody from Florida here? No Floridians? Okay, well, we can go for it then. We can just let it loose. Brady, what's it like in Florida of the 1920s?
Pretty awful.
Pretty bad there. Pretty tough times going on in Florida. Pretty bad. Yeah. Evan, what's going on there? We've ended enslavement. Sure, we're all...
Not quite.
Not quite. What happens?
So there was a lot more incarceration of minorities, and then after the incarceration, the prisons were partnering with companies to essentially release the prisoners for work, and it was free labor. So right back where we started.
Right back where we started. Yeah, there's this little weird clause in that constitutional amendment, that little trick to preserve free labor if you can get it, or basically a kind of enslavement for the people who are on the other side. A little trick that says if you are in prison if you are in prison under a felony or in prison at all, perhaps, then you can be made to work. And in some cases for corporations, in some cases for landowners, at least in Florida, they finally ended that after a while. So again, I don't want to say that everything is the same now. There was one thing that I thought was really interesting about this, as long as we're talking about Florida. And by the way, we shouldn't all pick on Florida at once. These things are happening all over the place, but it's hot again. It's like Florida. Oh, there's nothing good about Florida, and it's hot. It is hot. We'll turn the air back on.
I guess my energy was there about it. Nice cars, but you're still able to but the other than that, it's flat and hot and wet.
Flat, hot, wet. Well, I mean, when I retire there. Why would they want? All right, let's not pick too much on Florida. But on page 199, I just want to read this part. They were talking about how in Florida, here's one difference about Florida, that they have basically a equal share of blacks and whites in the state. So that is different from many northern states where it's not the same share. But here's the thing. As a result, the white community tended to see its own position as somehow under threat. The politically and socially dominant now recasting themselves as victims. So all of a sudden they're saying they're the victims. And I just wanted to point out a continuity thing that in every generation in this country, since at least the 1860s and maybe before, I don't know, I wasn't around, there is a significant portion of whites who believe they are the disadvantaged people and they are the victims of society. It happened after the Civil War. It happened in the 1920s, as we just read about. It happened in the 1960s. If you look back at the polling, Martin Luther King leading the famous I Have a Dream March on Washington, arguing for civil rights. If you look at the polling, a majority of white people at that time believed that black people had equal rights to them in their community. I know, 1960s. In every generation, I grew up feeling this too. I felt like I was the victim, I was disadvantaged. In every generation. So I know people say that this is a new thing, that people are, feeling disadvantaged. We can talk about the changing structures of racism and the changing ways in which, we're not doing the same things. We don't have the same laws. We're hopefully not going marauding people's neighborhoods. However, this has stayed constant throughout time, or it's been one thing that is true in every generation, is that somehow the whites, the majority of whites believe they are the new victims and are disadvantaged in American society. You want to know how politics is playing out? In the last 10 years, that's exactly a repeat of what's been going on for generations. Now, Boas and his buddies in anthropology were fighting a little bit here. Cyrus, what's Boas fighting here?
Fighting for right. The black people in American society, instead of like the folks that like native people.
Oh,
It was like
Yeah, other people did not like that. So Boas and his anthropological cohorts were fighting against this idea of an inherent biological racism, that the relationships that people had to each other were somehow inherently locked into their biology. And so he's certainly fighting to minimize the idea of a biological race difference. He is also certainly fighting, as we've talked about, the idea of ethnocentrism, especially when it came to people who were far away. So the ideas of people in Samoa or the Native Americans, people who had a culturally other system. He was very good about fighting for the idea that there isn't any advantages to our civilized society over that of so-called savages. We've looked at all of this. It was certainly better than some of the other trends in anthropology at the time, such as Lewis Henry Morgan's idea of an ascendancy from savagery to civilization. And it was better than the ideas that were being used to try and justify the biological racism. However, it wasn't anthropology. Boas and others went along with or even supported the idea that Black Americans may not be biologically inferior, but they might be culturally inferior. Now, I'm going to read a few quotes from King. This is on page 205. Cultural inferiority now stood in for the biological inferiority preached by the generation of Madison Grant. So for some people, they could take an anthropology class and say, oh, well, okay, fine. It's not biology. People are all biologically capable, but it's cultural. There's a socio-cultural difference, and it's an inferior one, and we have to fix it. And so, again, as King says, for Boas and his people, he saw faraway peoples as laboratories and nearby ones as pathologies. So as long as you were going to study off in Samoa or the Trobriand Islands or the Northwest Coast with the Kwakiutl, that was like, oh, let's find out what's going on in that society. But if it was close to you, it was sort of seen as being something wrong, something bad or something wrong or something inferior. Or as King puts it on page 210, after the pictures, right before the pictures. In the white-dominated human sciences, enlightened anthropologists commonly approach the behaviors and beliefs of Samoans and Admiralty Islanders as puzzles to be understood. So, why are they behaving the way they are? Let's figure out the puzzle using cultural relativism. Not as social diseases that needed curing. Doing the same thing in the American South or even north of Central Park was close to unthinkable. So if you tried to take the same method of cultural relativism and apply it in your own society in the South or in what was going on in Harlem, that was seemingly out of bounds. And for anthropology, they were always comparing what African Americans were doing with an idea of what was going on in Africa. So here King discusses the work of Melville Herskovits, who was a very famous student of Boas, but very interested in African-American folk traditions. But the question always was, well, how did they change? Are there any connections to Africa? Are the customs in the Americas simply a degraded version of what was better in Africa? So basically what I'm trying to say here is that although Boas, it's true, Cyrus is correct that Boas was making a lot of enemies because he was fighting against some of the dominant trends in US society, and anthropologists were out on the edges of that. But in terms of how people slid into these ideas of simply thinking, well, it's a cultural problem, not a race problem, that was all a kernel of possibility in anthropology. So into this situation, or into this this environment, we have this chapter is about the work of Zora Neale Hurston, who was trying to be an anthropologist. So we've been talking about Margaret Mead going off to Samoa, and Ruth Benedict and other people who were being trained by Boas in this new field of study called anthropology. And here's Zora Neale Hurston, who shows up and also wants to be an anthropologist. What do you think, Felicia? A good anthropologist?
She wasn't at first, but she was asking people to tell stories. So she wasn't serious, so people didn't take that serious. And she got serious later.
She got serious later. So at first it was, it was difficult, in part because of the structure of US society at the time and who could study whom and who would even want to talk to you. There's sort of a divide among the people who come from the academic side of anthropology. There's the people who think, okay, so first of all, Zora Neale Hurston was never able to become an anthropologist and have an academic position, and there's no textbook that she wrote. She wrote a lot of novels and a lot of very good books, but there's nothing that is read really in anthropology or was read up until recently. And so there's kind of two schools of thought that the Boasians have fallen into. On the one side are the people that say, oh, she should have been an anthropologist, but it was the structure of US society which kept her in academia, which kept her from being that. And there are other people. I remember being in a graduate seminar with one of them who would have been a student of Benedict's way back in the day. And as one person asked about Zora Neale Hurston, he said, well, she didn't do the best ethnography. She didn't do the best anthropological fieldwork. And I could tell for the other students sitting in this class that this was a real blow, because this person, Zora Neale Hurston, was actually in some ways an incredible anthropologist. So, in my take on this is that, for one thing, one of the limits was the structure of US society, which we've just talked about. It was, these were times when the possibilities were foreclosing on many people. There was the Harlem Renaissance, which was going on, so there was that she was able to tap into, but in other places it was getting difficult. And certainly the academy, in terms of she was often the only student of color, the only Black student in her classes, and in some ways not often kind of shut out from the circuits of power in that sense. And also, if you read, who knows why she and Boas fought so much, but, she'd go in with all these field notes, and then Boas would make her cry because he wanted to have her do something more systematic and write a so-called real ethnography. So he wanted her to do something that she didn't want to do. She had a sort of a different idea. So on the one hand, you could say, well, it was part of society. But the other thing that I would say is, as King points out, by the time, and as Felicia said, she got good, she got serious about it. By the time that, since 1927, as on page 212, she had spent more time on the Gulf Coast than Boas, Mead, and Benedict had ever spent in their own field sites. So she was actually doing a longer term, more immersive field work than some of the people who got to be these big name, big time anthropologists. She also wrote in a style which located the people she was studying as real people doing real things in history. So Margaret Mead had this style, which came to be known as the ethnographic present. And it basically put it would talk about when you show up in a village, you see, and it would use the present tense, as if the people were frozen in time forever. So you can still read Coming of Age in Samoa, and it'll be like nobody has changed since 1928. It's like they're still the same. You can still see them. They're still running. They're still jumping. They're still doing exactly what they're doing. They're still having carefree sex and being adolescents, as if nothing ever changes. Whereas Hurston was writing, she was writing in the past tense because she was locating people in history. So as King says on page 213, she put on permanent display one of the deepest of Boasian messages, that all cultures change, even while anthropologists are busy trying to write up their field notes about them. So this is something that should have been recognized as an innovation in ethnographic writing, but it took years and years until people caught up to what Zora Neale Hurston was trying to do. And finally, at the end of the chapter, King talks about her larger project, which was not just anthropology, but a larger body of work and fiction, growing body of published fiction. The whole point of Mules and Men, as with her growing body of published fiction, was not to talk just about Black people or to embalm Negro culture for future study in a classroom. Rather, she imagined it as a grand project to confirm the basic humanity of people who are thought to have lost it. So a grand project to confirm the humanity of a people who are thought to have lost it. And what she's saying is that these were not sort of degraded versions of some culture that was in Africa, that it was alive and valuable in the present. And it had to be documented and appreciated for what it was, not as a pathology or a disease that needed to be fixed. So this chapter in the middle of the book, and we will talk more about Zora Neale Hurston's work later, brings us back to a question that in some ways I asked before I asked, would it have been different if the Lewis Henry Morgan style of anthropology had been dominant? That is to say, if there had been no Boas to fight against it and to make people mad. So on the one hand, you have United States society that we've talked about, a society that in the 1920s is turning to eugenics, is enacting very racist laws, is having all the things that we just read about. Florida's going off into its Florida self, is becoming more anti-immigrant, is closing the borders, becoming more anti-Semitic. And a lot of anthropologists were part of that. And so we talked about how, yes, Boas got a lot of enemies because he was himself an immigrant, Jewish from Germany, that was not exactly the friendliest place when we're talking about World War I and World War II. And so he was fighting against a lot of this stuff that was going on. So on the one hand, you have Boasian anthropology fighting against some of the mainstream trends in US society. We talked about the SAT scores and the IQ tests, and that anthropologists are fighting those ideas that those are a natural indication of intelligence. However, well, let's pause for a second. Taylor, you said you didn't like this chapter. Why not?
I liked it, but I didn't. It was like, it was more great. It was a little bit.
I think this chapter, I agree with you that this chapter is incredibly frustrating. It's much nicer to read about the heroics of Margaret Mead going off there and coming back and punching out and doing some stuff. This chapter is incredibly frustrating, I think, because you have these structures that are coming into place. You have the Boasians doing their thing, but at the same time, there's a different alternative that might have been available to them. You have to wonder, what if the Boasians had allied themselves with Zora Neale Hurston and with Du Bois, who were trying to emphasize a different way of looking at US society, of looking at the African-American experience. And it's not like they didn't know about each other. Obviously they did, because Hurston was studying under Boas. Obviously Du Bois and Boas was giving lectures at Howard University, so they knew about these alternatives. You can't say, oh, they just didn't know. They were, sometimes we get caught up and they say, don't worry, he was just a man of his time. Well, sure. I mean, obviously there's, he was progressive for his time, but there was also these other ideas that not only were out there, they actually knew each other and crossed over there. I spent a lot of time working on these arrows to try and get them in the right place, because there was overlap. There was obviously overlap. I don't know if I got the arrows in the correct place. So both of these tendencies are in some ways counter to US society, but in somewhat different directions. And I do sometimes wonder, it is sort of frustrating, I think, this chapter, because you wonder what would have happened if people had made different alliances. Could it have been any different?